Scott, you got a message. Good just afternoon, everyone. I'm Amherst Williams. I'm the executive director of the Connecticut League of History Organizations. I want to welcome you all here today. I am zooming to you from Boston, where I'm going to the American Society for Environmental History Conference. So if I have that weird, spotty internet for any reason, it's just because I'm in a hotel room instead of at home where I usually am. We're really excited to have so many people signed up for this session today, where we're going to be learning some more about the data that we have been gathering, or that actually Connecticut Humanities has been gathering with Susie Wilkening of Wilkening Consulting. Actually, Susie's been doing the data gathering, let's be honest. But at the behest of Connecticut Humanities and the entirety of sort of the humanities, arts, and cultural community here in Connecticut. So I'm really excited to see so many people here today. And just a couple of items of business before we get started. As usual, we will be recording this session, and the recording will be up on the CLHO YouTube channel afterwards. And if you registered for this session, you'll also get a follow-up email from Emily Garfinkel, our amazing membership and programs manager, afterwards, with a link to the recording, slide deck, and any other resources we think might be useful to you all. So we have with us here today, in addition to Emily and myself, Scott Wands, who is the Deputy Director of Grants and Programs. Give him all a round of applause for his recent promotion. At Connecticut Humanities, and Susie Wilkening of Wilkening Consulting. I'm going to hand things over to Scott quickly, and who will hand things over to Susie. But I understand that we'll have ample time after Susie's presentation on these broader population survey findings about sorry, my father is texting me right now and it's distracting me. Apologies. We'll have ample opportunity for Q&A after Susie's presentation. So I'm going to mute myself and hand things over to you, Scott.
Thank you, Amherst, and thank you, Emily, and thank you for all of our friends and partners over at the Connecticut League of History Organizations, who are such great hosts and help make these events so successful. We have, as I was telling folks earlier, nearly 200 people that are registered with us today, and really excited to be able to share our survey findings. I am not going to talk long. I'm going to be passing this over to Susie very shortly, but just wanted to provide a little bit of context here for what we're going to be providing to you all today. I know many of you are organizations in Connecticut, museums, historical societies, arts organizations, cultural organizations that have been receiving Connecticut Cultural Fund operating support grants from us at Connecticut Humanities the past 2 Decembers. And as you well know, as grant recipients, you have been filling out surveys as a result of that. So that is part of the work we've done with Susie Wilkening, and we are sharing the findings of who we are as a sector. And again, this has resulted in $30.7 million of state funds, general funds, that have gone out in the last 2 fiscal years. 632 grants, $16.1 million at the end of 21 for work in the last calendar year, and another 8.5 million, 724 grants that went out in December of this year. So we will continue to share information about who you are, and we've just recently released some new data stories, which I'll put the link for in the chat here as well. But that is not what we're here to talk about today, although it relates very much to what we're here to talk about today. We want to know who you all are, the work that you do, the visitors that you serve, but we also wanted to hear what Connecticut residents, whether they go to your sites or not, think about the work that we do, museum work, arts work. And that's the presentation that Susie will be sharing. We surveyed 1,000 Connecticut residents in about this time, spring of last year. And there are some interesting findings that we hope you will all also find useful. And we want to talk about how you might be able to incorporate this into the decision-making you make at institutions, and how your public wants to think about things from you, and also for us and for you for advocacy purposes, about how when you talk to your legislators, you can let them know what the public thinks about arts, culture, tourism, the work that we all do together. And with that, I will pass it over to Susie to let you know about the survey.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks, Amherst and Emily, for hosting us today. I'm saying good morning because it's 9 in the morning here, as my day is just kicking off here in Seattle. So yeah, about a year ago, we went into the field because we wanted to look at the other side of the cultural sector, which is the attitudes of people who live in Connecticut itself and how they think about the cultural sector and what they do for them or for their colleagues, for family members, their co-residents in their communities, and also, for the state as well. And so when we put together this survey, we were thinking about what are those things that we want to understand about how people perceive the cultural sector in Connecticut. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I forgot to do that. There we go. And I also want to make sure I have the chat open if I can. Let's see here. Yes, I'm going to open up the chat just in case. So I can watch that. Actually, I am not finding the chat easily. Okay, can't find it right now. I'll keep going. And Scott or Emily, you can let me know if there's something in the chat that I need to know about. Okay, so back in last April, we surveyed, as Scott said, more than 1,000 Connecticut adult residents. And this is a sample that generally represents the population of Connecticut. We were wanting to make sure it represented the Connecticut population by educational attainment, by age, by race, and by ethnicity. So it generally does do that, so we can get a really good idea of what people in Connecticut think about the arts and culture and humanities sector. It was fielded through Alchemer, which is our survey host, but also what I found is the most representative public sampling service that we have out there available to us. And we had two big takeaways that we wanted to just kind of right off the bat share with all of you. And you're going to feel really good about this in a minute. Because virtually all Connecticut residents engage in the arts, culture, and humanities, either formally or informally. Actually, 91% of Connecticut residents participate in some kind of cultural activity. For the most part, a lot of it is what we call informal cultural activities. We'll look at what they are a bit more specifically in a few minutes, but that can be anything from reading a book, going to a museum is just very informal. The average Connecticut resident picked just under 4 activities off of the list. You'll see the list in a minute. And looking specifically at performing arts and museums, because that's what the bulk of the organizations that Connecticut Humanities is funding right now. And that makes it the bulk of the cultural sector, not all, but the bulk. 41% of Connecticut residents visited either a performing arts facility or a museum or both. And then last year, we had that first year funding of 632 organizations that were funded, that were included in that funding round. The other takeaway is that most Connecticut residents think that the arts, culture, and humanities deliver important impacts in Connecticut, and they support the state's investment in the cultural sector. And these are going to be some really amazing numbers. 81% of Connecticut residents think cultural organizations contribute to their community's economy. 89% would think positively of an elected official taking legislative action to support cultural organizations in their community. 88% agree that the Connecticut legislature should work to support our state's cultural organizations. And 50% of Connecticut residents think that the state's not providing enough support for the cultural organizations. Right now, the Connecticut Humanities Council funding that's going through the Office of the Arts, it's costing the state just under $4.50 per Connecticut resident. And half of Connecticut residents think this should be increased. So these are some pretty amazing numbers that we see a lot of support for the cultural sector among people in Connecticut. Okay, so that's the big story right there. But let's explore more detail what's going on. So we're back to that first takeaway. Virtually all Connecticut residents, you already saw this slide. We saw these 91% do something, average 3.8 activities. But let's actually take a look at the list. So these are the activities that we were measuring on the sampling. The biggest one is reading a book for pleasure. About 3 out of 5 Connecticut residents said they read at least one book for pleasure in that previous 2 years. Pursuing hobbies and crafts, traveling for leisure, participating in outdoor nature experiences that can be hiking, And you can see as we go down the list. Now we highlighted in blue those two that we really are interested in particular, about attending performing arts and visiting a museum. Now, if you are not a performing arts organization or you're not a museum, we still have some other things that we're picking up on your behalf. If you're like a civics organization or a literary organization, we got some more things for you as well. But this was, the bulk of the funding goes to those kinds of museums. That's the bulk of the cultural sector. We wanted to look at those specifically. And what we see is just a little over a quarter for performing arts, and also just over a quarter for visiting a museum. They're pretty much neck and neck right in there. And they both beat attending sporting events, which is something that the museum sector likes to talk a lot about. More people visit museums than visit professional sporting events. We didn't even say professional, we just said sporting events. And we still edge out those sporting events. Okay. Oops. Here's another way to look at it, though, because we wanted to really look at and think about that performing arts and museums in particular. We simplified it down. Here's that 9% that said they didn't do anything. Here's the 41%, that bluish wedge of the pie, that said they either went to museums or performing arts or both. Now, if we break down that 41%, what we see is that about 12% of Connecticut residents participate in both museums and performing arts. About 13% of Connecticut residents visited a museum but did not go to performing arts. And about 15% went to performing arts but not museums. And there's some rounding things going on here to make it. Does it actually add up? This doesn't even add up to, it adds up to 40%. It's rounding as to make it like that. And then 50% of Connecticut residents didn't visit museums or performing arts, but they still were participating in cultural activities of some sort. So we asked them about their motivations. Now we're going to have a lot of data charts here. If you don't like data charts, sorry, but there's going to be a lot of data charts here. So we want to give you these numbers so you can actually see what they're saying. Interest is the biggest driver, interest and fun. So if you think about your leisure time, the time that you spend doing the things that you enjoy, they're probably interesting and fun. That's why you're doing them. You want that respite, escape, relaxation. Those are the big motivations for participating in arts, culture, and humanities. We also see some of those social aspects as well, spending time with family, not necessarily kids, but can be. Learning experiences comes in as well, but you see that that's a lower motivation. There's a smaller segment of the population that has that strong learning as a motivation. They tend to be more avid museum goers and performing arts attendees, but learning is not the motivation for most people. And then you see curiosity going down the list, and then a smaller percentage saying my children enjoy them or learning experiences for my children. Now keep in mind, the percentage of parents in this sample is going to be roughly representative of the Connecticut population. It's going to be, a smaller percentage in the overall sample. So that's those responses are almost always the smallest, simply because it's a smaller sample of parents responding. How they hear about community events, we want to understand those places that they're going to find out about information in their community. Now, what's really tricky about it is that the most common ways they're hearing about community events are pretty ephemeral. Word of mouth is the big one. They're hearing about from their friends or their family members or their co-workers. Facebook, that's pretty ephemeral too, because who knows who's going to see what links or posts are popping up. Other social media, and it's only about a third of the population that are hearing more directly from organizations. And that's where you get those emails from the organization or company sponsoring the event. So those more ephemeral and less formal kinds of marketing tactics are the ones that are actually more effective for the public. We asked respondents if they were to go to visit a museum. Here we're going to do that museum lens specifically. If they were going to visit a museum, what kind of museum would they visit? Now, the people who'd already said in the survey they don't ever visit museums, because there are some people like that, they didn't get this question. So these are only people who are potential visitors, ones who have some openness to visiting a museum. Zoos and aquariums win. They always win. We see this in national sampling as well. Consistently, those are the most popular forms of museums in the United States and in Connecticut. Interestingly, this is where Connecticut is different than national sampling, because you have art museums and centers coming in number 2. Nationally, history museums usually come in number 2, and art museums usually come in behind history. They're pretty close. I mean, we're off by a few percentage points with historic sites, but what we see is this more it's spread out for Connecticut versus history, usually taking that number 2 slot pretty definitively. And then, children's museums usually are the least popular, but that's because it's a smaller segment of the population who has young children who are going to be interested in visiting a children's museum. So that makes sense when we think about through that lens. Question, but this is about performing arts. And people who said, I don't ever visit the performing arts, I don't ever do any of that stuff, they did not get this question. Instead, it was the ones who said that they were open to going to the performing arts. And what you see is that plays and musicals and contemporary music, which could be country, rock, R&B, any kind of concert like that, those are the most popular forms of performing arts that they would attend if they were going to go to a performing arts facility. And then there are other types of performing arts that have a narrower segment of the population who are interested in them, like opera, choral music, things like that. Now, that's still a good percentage of the population. If you think about the population of Connecticut, and you're still saying, 10% is still a pretty good segment, but it's just going to be narrower than it will be for Taylor Swift, let's say. Other arts, cultural, and humanities activities. Now, if you are not a museum or you're not a performing arts facility, but you're still in the humanities sector, this arts and cultural and humanities sector, this is the question that we were trying to pick up a lot of these other things that are going on in the sector that aren't strictly museums and performing arts. So here we're picking up, listening to music at home, which is a big thing that people do. 70% of the population, that's number 1. Watching movies or attending cinema, 55%. So we still have the majority looking at that. Watching performing arts at home, history activities are less formal, so it could be things that they're doing on their own, and then arts and crafts, sewing, fiber arts, you can see down the list. So there are a number of these things that we're hitting on that are also of interest that are in this sector as well. And the average respondent picked about 3 of these activities, so we see some breadth of interest as well. Now, we're shifting here a little bit now to a little bit more philosophical questions. We were asking some pretty straightforward questions like, where are you going? What are you doing? Why are you doing it? Those kinds of things. What would you go do? Now we're getting into more of, okay, what should these organizations be accomplishing? What should be that impact of these organizations? And this is a question that we use a lot in our sampling, not only in Connecticut, but throughout the United States. If you've recently taken a survey from a museum through the annual survey, museum goers, you saw a very similar question to this. And you can see, how should they be engaging you with their content? The most popular answer was being exposed to different perspectives or customs. About half of respondents said that. Providing a place of that respite, escape, and beauty out of our daily lives. We get this a lot. People have their hectic lives. They're looking for that place to take that deep breath, step out of their daily lives, relax. Think about that lovely, it's almost April. So let's see, end of April, walk through a botanical garden. It's going to be beautiful. It's going to be relaxing. It's going to make you feel good. So those kinds of activities that they're thinking about. And then you can see down the list, gaining knowledge, learning things, producing facts. Let me make up my own mind. That's there's a segment of the population that really likes that one. And then you see, though, looking at the bottom, that the inclusion answer here is the least popular answer. About 1 in 5 respondents here chose that answer. And I want to call this out just briefly, just so we can contextualize this. When we're doing sampling on inclusion, and Wilkening Consulting, we do a lot of sampling on this topic. We never use one question to decide if somebody has an inclusive mindset or not. It's not fair. So we want to make sure we're understanding the survey psychology of an inclusive question and an inclusive answer and what's going on here. When you ask someone directly about inclusion in a cultural setting, what tends to happen is we get what are known as a law of false positives. People know that saying inclusion is the right thing to do, know that's the right answer, and I'm putting the right in quotes because this is about survey psychology. I actually do think it's the right answer, but some people know it's the right answer, but they may not actually believe it themselves. And so they choose it because they don't want to be that person who, I'm not racist, I'm not going to not say this is bad. And we get what are called false positives because their attitudes don't actually match the answer they gave in a survey. There are times that we ask these questions, but we do so knowing that happens. This is an opposite kind of scenario. This is a question that does not read as a question about inclusion. It reads as what should these organizations be doing? And so the people who chose that inclusive answer, that 1 in 5, we can pretty much assume that they are inclusive because they don't feel judged if they skip over it. They really do believe it. And that's what we tend to see consistently in sampling. It does not mean that the other 80% are anti-inclusive. Some are. Some are ambivalent and some are inclusive and just missed the answer. So we don't really know anything about the other 80% based on this one question, but we can say that here about 20% we can feel confident do have inclusive attitudes. All that makes sense for everybody? Everybody whose screens are on, nod if it makes sense. Thank you. Okay. And that's a topic we can always come back to and talk about more. Okay. Impact of cultural organizations in the community. Access is the big one. About half of respondents chose that. Education brings the community together. Those are all clustering in that 40% range. The typical respondent chose about 3 of these choices. So you can get a sense of how many things they're choosing off this list. Tourism is not the biggest impact that is perceived by residents in Connecticut. About 1 in 5 say, yeah, it's great, it attracts tourists, but that's not as much a driver for them, and they're thinking about this impact as these other things that are more important to their local community and the local community residents. We asked if cultural organizations should be forums for civil discourse. And what we found here is some ambivalence. I mean, we did see 1/3 of the population said, yep, absolutely. But the larger percentage was like, oh, this is such a hard thing right now. And maybe, but you just have to be really careful if you're going to do this. So some ambivalence because they're being really cautious given how politically fraught our times are right now. About 14% say this is not an appropriate role for cultural organizations, and then 11% say civil discourse is not even possible today.
But still, we're at 3/4 of the people feeling, yes, if you do it right, it's more important to do it. We're only 1/4 are saying there's not, this isn't our role, this isn't our venue.
Yep. And so we're going to be having more data, not just from Connecticut, but from our national samples that we have in the field right now, about this idea of civic engagement in cultural settings. And that's going to be coming out later this fall because we're in the field still right now. So this is something that if you're interested in doing this, to keep an eye on. And we're going to have another Connecticut sample with more information about that probably by midsummer. So if you're into civil discourse, we've got a lot more coming. And then we really want them to drill down at like, what are the most important ways that you should be serving Connecticut communities? Those issues in your community, those seem to be the most important thing. About 3 out of 5 are saying, you can help us understand these issues that we're having. A similar number, if you look down to the 3rd choice, was where we're getting to those art experiences and stewardship of natural and cultural resources, that more traditional viewpoint of arts and cultural organizations, which is still a really good viewpoint. And then in that middle ground, about half are saying providing the space to build understanding between diverse groups and or giving voice to historically excluded groups. So that's where you see this expansion into understanding that a bit more, coming from about half the population. And because we're all different and we all have different needs, we asked this pretty specific question about access and support that respondent or their family members could use during a museum visit or a virtual program or any kind of cultural engagement like that. And the big story, I think, here is if we look down at the bottom, only 38%, or about 2 out of 5, said that none of these were needed by themselves or their family. The majority of people have constraints in their life, whether it is a physical or mental disability, or whether it's a financial need, that make it a little more challenging to engage in culture. And so understanding that the majority of people are experiencing these things for themselves or their family members, having a more deliberate plan to help people, didn't even know the ringer was on, to help people meet them where they need you to be. This is going to help you understand where that's falling on those different needs. The biggest one is financial. About 30% need reduced or free admission due to financial need. But then you see physical or mobility disabilities, 22%. This is a little bit higher for older respondents. And then you see other things coming down here that are less than 20% each. Okay. I'm going to look in the chat. I did find it finally, and see if there's, since we're going to move on to this next section, anything that I need to know about.
I think just Godfrey's comment there, that looking when we were going back on the discussion about habits that could be inclusive or less inclusive, feeling that some of the ways that we're defining them kind of became inclusive based on the very thing that you're measuring.
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be trickiness in how we word questions and how we present those kinds of ideas. And so we were deliberately wanting to measure some of these things. So it is going to affect how we ask, the question itself is going to be, and sometimes more inclusive, just because that's what we were trying to assess. One of the things when we're asking more specifically inclusive questions is we always want to make sure we're giving opportunity for respondents to share their viewpoints accurately. So when we do very specific inclusive questions, we have anti-inclusive response choices. So people can, if that's how they feel, they can respond that way. We have more ambivalent response choices, because if that's how they feel, they can then respond accurately. Because when it comes to really assessing inclusion, we want to have an accurate assessment of inclusion. And so we try to balance those questions and ask them in different ways to triangulate so we can really understand where somebody is on those attitudes, if that makes sense. But yeah, some of the things that we're measuring, that's because that's what we were trying to assess. Okay. The second takeaway is the impacts in Connecticut and the state's investment in the sector. Here's just that reminder. We had these really impressive results here about people's positive perceptions about the impact of the community and the state's support of the community.
I can just go back 1 second, Susie, because the bottom right one is one that we actually changed. And if you have increased or maintained, it goes up to 92%. So we've got 50% saying it should be increased. But when you put the folks that are thinking that 450 is a good investment, we're at 92% of the population thinking this is a worthwhile investment. And again, half of those are feeling like it needs to be increased and it's not enough.
And these numbers are similar to what we see nationally when we do this kind of polling nationally as well. So Connecticut is fitting right into a broader pattern, which gives us even more confidence in these results, because you're fitting into that broader pattern nationally as well. Okay, so we're going to go into some deeper details. And here we're going to really more specifically at those museums and performing arts audiences, because those are the big chunks that you are doing and serving the public through. A lot of these two audiences, there's a lot of overlap, but then there are also some key differences. And then we want to kind of pick that apart so you can understand that. So here, just to remind you, 41% of survey respondents attended both museums, one or both museums and performing arts. And here we're breaking it down into that 41% is now a new whole of them. It's almost a third. I mean, if you want to do it as shorthand, a third. About a third are going to museums but not performing arts. About a third are going to performing arts but not museums, and about a third are going to both. That's just your shorthand, a third. But where do we see differences? So when we look at those differences, what we see when it comes to other leisure time activities, the people who go to museums are more interested in participating in outdoor and nature activities. And people who do performing arts are more interested in sporting events and reading. So that's where we're starting to pick apart some differences in those interests. When it comes to impact, people who visit museums are more likely to say diversity and cultural awareness are an important impact of the cultural sector, as well as increasing cognitive health. Performing arts, they're more likely to say that access to art is a bigger impact. Bringing the community together and having that common shared experience together, that's a more important impact to them. Now, the differences are not huge, but it's enough for us to flag. There's motivations. Why are they engaging in the cultural sector? Museum visitors are more motivated by learning, the act of learning for themselves, or for their children's needs, which can also include the act of learning for their children. So that learning aspect is a bigger driver within the museum audience than the performing arts audience. Performing arts audience is more motivated by time with friends, their interests, and fun. So that's a stronger driver for them. So we're seeing, again, these differences.
And I want to encourage you all, we're not looking at this as like a museums versus performing arts, cage match here, but instead, if you are a museum and you have a campus and you are not fully utilizing your outdoor spaces and your grounds, this might be something that you might be wanting to think about doing more of, because according to CT residents, that is something that is more of interest to museum goers. Or if you're on the performing arts side of things, knowing that your visitors have a correlation with sporting events and sporting needs, maybe there are ways that you can start to integrate or collaborate with sporting events in your community, or getting more involved with hitting at those residents that have interest in reading.
Right. And those motivations, I mean, if you're a performing arts organization, you're not going to say, hey, come to see Swan Lake. It's a great learning opportunity. You're probably going to say, come to Swan Lake with your friends or your family. And you're going to enjoy this relaxing and beautiful experience. I mean, it's thinking about those motivations and reflecting them back to the community as you're framing what you're doing. Now, this does not mean that if you have something that's a harder hitting play or a really difficult content that you're sharing at a museum, that you are going to say, hey, come to this play about this really difficult topic. It's going to be fun. No, you're not going to do that. But for the most part, you can kind of understand how these motivations are differing, so you can kind of reflect that for a lot of your content. And then similarly for civil discourse, what we're seeing is that people are more likely to see museums as places for civil discourse than the performing arts. So just a different perception of how those types of organizations are serving and should be serving residents in Connecticut. And we see something really similar when it comes to how cultural organizations can serve the community. Those museum audiences are more likely to say conversations on critical issues and giving voice to excluded groups. That's a stronger feeling among the museum audience than the performing arts, which is more likely to say access to visual and performing arts experiences. So you can see how these motivations link to their expectations that they have for what they're going to experience for themselves and also for those who are with them, whether it's people that are bringing with them directly or just people in the audience with them or other visitors at a museum with them, and those expectations as well. So let's look at this demographically, because that's also helping us understand some of these differences too. What we see is that the museum demographic skews younger than the performing arts demographic. The median age of a museum goer in Connecticut is 42. The median age of a performing arts attendee is 52. That's a pretty big difference. And so with those museums, a lot of this difference has to do with children. Parents and guardians of children 10 and younger are the most likely segment of the population, not only in Connecticut, but nationwide, to have visited a museum in the past year or two. But they're less likely to be visiting performing arts. So if you are a parent of a 2-year-old, are you going to go to the Lutz Children's Museum? Because I see Patricia there on my screen. Or are you going to take that 2-year-old to see Swan Lake? I mean, it's a pretty easy decision. So when you think about families and their needs, what we see is that higher attendance at museums with those families, which then brings down that median age and also changes the expectations of that audience and what's going to be accomplished there. Performing arts are skewing older. And so if they are a parent or guardian visiting the performing arts, they're more likely to have children who are teens or maybe tweens, so middle school or high school age. The museum audience, about 41% of that audience has a college degree. Now, here's where we're going to have a little bit of a, you might be having like a what moment? And so we really want to think about here, when we think about things like that 41% of audiences have a college degree, my comment earlier that parents of young children are the most likely audience to visit museums, is what we want to distinguish here is a difference between incidence and frequency. We are not looking necessarily at really frequent museum goers or frequent performing arts visitors. So people who are visiting frequently often have a different demographic profile than those who may be visiting more casually or sporadically. Here, we're looking at everybody. And we're not asking as much about frequency as just, have you done this activity in the past year or two? So that's called incidence. It's like more of a yes, no binary choice. So when we look at that bigger picture of who's actually visiting museums and just as a group, that's why we see 41% of audiences have a college degree. When we sample frequent museum goers, people who are like on your email list or your members, that's probably going to be somewhere between 80 and 90% for college degrees. So just keep in mind that your frequent visitors are going to look demographically different than your casual and sporadic visitors. With the performing arts, also, there in that case, the majority have a college degree. The performing arts does skew a little bit more higher level of education than museums. And then what we see for museums as well, they were about 50% more likely to identify as an ally to the LGBTQ plus community. So they're more likely to have that, that feeling of support for that LGBTQ plus community than what we see among performing arts respondents. Okay, I'm going to say, look in the chat. Is there any questions here on this one? Because there's a lot to unpick on this slide. I want to just make sure that if anybody has a burning question, we go ahead and address it here.
There's nothing in the chat right now
Okay.
that has not been answered.
Okay. So then, we have this question, what about those individuals in the community who do activities that are arts and cultural related, but they're not visiting museums and they're not going to performing arts? Generally, their responses were lower on pretty much everything. They did fewer activities, so that, whereas like a museum person might average a certain number of activities, they're averaging fewer number of activities. They are just lower levels of engagement overall on all these other things that we're measuring. They are less likely to be inclusive in their attitudes. I mean, just everything that we were looking at and measuring, they're just lower on, so just a lower level. And then that 9% who doesn't do anything at all, they are lower yet again. But for the people who are doing arts and cultural activities, just not going to museums or performing arts specifically, they generally match the attitudes on the public polling questions about the cultural sector, which is those questions about the legislature and the financial support of the cultural sector from the state. They were right there just as supportive as those who actually go to museums and performing arts, which tells us that support is really high for cultural organizations, even among people who don't visit them. They like having you in your community. They think you're important to the community and for making that community what it is, even if you're not fitting into their lives in a way that makes them visit. So that importance is really something to keep in mind as you're thinking through your impact in the community. It's more than just that person who's coming in the door. Okay.
We do have a question before you jump to demographics here from Kate Schramm, who was wondering about, I think, the 9% about the folks that aren't doing things, and are these individuals correlating to a specific demographic or any other features about the ones that aren't really participating informally or formally?
Yeah, so I often call them the no-no-nos. It's like basically whatever I ask them, they tell me no. Like, have you been to a sporting event? No. Have you read a book? No. So the main thing about them is they tend to have a little bit lower, not a huge amount, but a little bit lower level of educational attainment. They tend not to have any political identity. They tend to say, I don't care about politics, which is another form of disengagement. Because basically what we're seeing is that 9% is disengaged with the cultural sector, but it's not just the cultural sector they're disengaged with. They're disengaged with a lot of things. So they're disengaged with the news and politics and all of that as well. One of the things when we look at that segment and start trying to understand what's going on in their lives that might be causing that disengagement, what we tend to see is that these are often individuals who are scrambling to just live their lives. And they don't have room in their lives to think beyond the day-to-day challenges that they're facing for whatever reason that they may be facing those challenges. For many of these people, this is something that is systemic in their lives, but other people cycle in and out of that percentage of the population too. So if you think about like when maybe a member of your family had a severe medical health crisis, you kind of go into that phase for a little bit, but then you're probably going to emerge back to what your normal resting spot is. So it can be also a temporary phase, but for most of those people in that demographic, tends to be a more systemic phase. And cultural activities that take place outside museums and performing arts venues. That's where we're getting to cinema. That's where we're getting to doing activities at home. Maybe it can be genealogy, doing genealogy at home, but not actually going to a museum. It could be reading a book. It can be participating in a book club, but it's just something that's informal, that's outside of those museums and performing arts. And I know there's a lot of these organizations in Connecticut that are also serving those individual people who are interested in those things as well, as just outside of that museums and performing arts venue sector.
As a time check, just wanted to let you know we're at about 12:45.
Okay. Any data collection on visitors, participants who decide to volunteer and give back in their community in that way? Not in this survey, but there will be limited data on that later this year coming from out of the annual survey museum goers, and we're going to have a stable Connecticut sample out of that too. So there will be some, it'll be through the lens of museum volunteering, but it'll still give us some more information there. Can the Connecticut data be juxtaposed with any corresponding national data? To some extent. There's some of these questions we have asked nationally through the annual survey of museum goers, because we do broader population sampling at the same time. And sometimes we have similar or the same questions, and sometimes we have very different questions. So some of this data, yes, we can correspond to national data and compare. We just need to know exactly what your questions are, and then we can say, oh, we have that question nationally, or no, we don't. Okay, moving on, since it's 9:46, demographics and life stage. We only have about 8 more slides, so we're doing good. Looking at audiences, and here we're looking through that lens of people of color. What we find is that among people who identified as white, but not multi-ethnic and not multiracial, so white only, I guess you could say, 42% of white people attended one or both museums and performing arts. Among people of color, it was 36%. So there is a gap there, but it's not a huge gap. And it's a gap that has been shrinking over the past few years. And nationally, in 2022, there was no gap on this nationally. There's still a little bit of that gap in Connecticut. We'll have 2023 numbers nationally. I'm pulling that data down. Actually, I was doing that earlier today. We'll probably have that data in the next week or two pulled down. So yeah, you're fitting within the national pattern kind of close. It's still narrowing that gap. And then if you look at what they're visiting, what we see is that the white population is a little bit more likely to go to performing arts, and the people of color are a little bit more likely skewing towards that museum visitation. So I think looking at this, I would say that museum audiences are a little bit more diverse than performing arts audiences in Connecticut. And then here we're looking at some of those demographic traits based on what we call the 4 major life stages that people can go through in their lives. We're mostly looking at by age and parental status. So we see young adults who are under 40 who do not have children. They may not ever have children. They may just not yet have children. A little bit less educational attainment because some of them are still in school. More diverse population, more likely to identify as part of the LGBTQ plus community, and a little bit less conservative, but they're also more likely to not care about politics. So they're not as engaged in that thinking yet. Parents and guardians of minor children, you can see some of their traits. And here we're looking mostly about other demographic traits, but also looking at those political traits as well. And then adults who are 40 and 59, no minor children. Some of them didn't have children. Some of them are empty nesters. You can see what's going on there. And then adults 60 or older with no minor children. You can review this slide later since you're all going to be getting it. But then let's look at where they're going, what kinds of, that performing arts versus museums activities. And what we see here is that for young adults, you see museums a little bit have an edge on performing arts, but not by much. But you do see that skew I mentioned earlier. Parents and guardians of minor children, they're more likely to be going to museums over performing arts venues. Whereas older adults, you see a skew more towards the performing arts. And then we also have these overall attendance. And what you see is that parents or guardians are most likely to be engaging in culture, probably because they're doing it for their kids or with their kids. And you see lower percentages of older adults participating in one or both museums or performing arts. This always tends to blow people's minds because when you think about who are your most frequent visitors, who are you seeing at performing arts, who are you seeing at the Historical Society lecture, who are you seeing in the museum, we tend to think of, oh, we have so many older adults visiting, where is that pipeline? But what you're seeing is a small segment of older adults who are visiting frequently. And so it feels like there's a lot of them. You're just doing a great job circulating the same people through your organizations over and over again. The majority of people who are older don't visit performing arts or museums at all. And then what you see is that among young adults, and in particular, young adults under 40, they're more likely to be in that casual or sporadic visitation. So they're not going to be as frequently, so it feels like there's fewer of them, but they're more likely to go in the first place. And this is why I don't worry about your pipeline. You have a pipeline. Life stage is getting in the way of it. You think through that life stage and everything they're going through at these different life stages, you have a better opportunity to bring in those younger adults more often. And then here are some of those activities and motivations. What you do see is that we have a greater breadth of activities taking place for young adults and parents. So they're averaging 4 to 5 activities versus 3 to 4 for those older adults. So they're doing a lot of different things, which is why they're not coming as often to your one place. It's because they are doing all these other things. And you can see those shifts in motivation. Young adults are motivated by a lot of really good things. They just have other things going on too. Parents focused on those children, and you can review all of this later. And then the last piece we wanted to share was that what we're seeing is that cultural does connect communities. And what we really mean by this is that once somebody starts getting involved with cultural activities, whether it's going to the museum, going to performing arts, going to any kind of cultural activity, those events tend to snowball for them. And so once somebody starts doing one thing, they're more likely to hear about other things. That's that word of mouth that they're interested in, and then they go make time and they go do those things. So it's a take on, if you need something to get done, you ask a busy person to do it. If you want to engage somebody in the cultural sector in a frequent way, you got to get them involved in that first thing, and it tends to snowball, and suddenly they're involved in 6 things. So think about it as that snowball effect, getting people in the door, and that snowball effect is going to happen. And that supporting having people come in the door at different cultural organizations is gonna and probably end up benefiting you as well. Those people who go to one thing are going to go to these other places too. So the more that we support each other, the better we're all going to do.
Our visitors are more civically engaged. I think that's the big thing.
That's another one too. Yes. They're more likely to vote. They're more likely to volunteer. They're more likely to do all those kinds of things. So when we look at cultural activities overall, I mean, the big sample of 1,000, the average number of cultural activities that people chose was 3.8. But when we looked for cultural consumers specifically, these are people who go into museums, people going to performing arts, it was 6.4. I mean, that's a lot more activities, right? And those who do more of these cultural activities, they credit cultural organizations with more social impact, think cultural organizations have improved their own lives, including their health, be a current or lapsed member, poll consistently higher on behalf of cultural organizations, and are more likely to vote. And then also are more likely to hold inclusive attitudes. The two primary categories for those more culturally connected people, parents and guardians of young children are actually one of them, because there's that presence of children in a household increases the tentacles basically out into the community over many times, and that increases their engagement with all those activities. It's like the classic on-ramp to community engagement is having children. But also people who self-identify as curious. That people who don't have children, but who identify as curious have far more engagements and tentacles in that community than people who don't identify as curious. So sparking that curiosity can also be a help. So to encourage more engagement, expanding access to families with young children, think about those on-ramps to community engagement for people who don't have kids. Young adults in particular, we see consistently nationally, but we saw it in Connecticut too, very interested in their community, but don't know how to get involved. They don't see those classic on-ramps because they don't have kids yet or maybe ever. And so how do you build up those on-ramps for people young adults without children to engage in the community? Spark curiosity in broader audiences, so it's easier to be courageous and try new things, including that in community engagement. Still, always keep in mind the constraints that exist in people's lives. We asked about this a little bit with that question about financial difficulties or disabilities. There's a lot of constraints that people experience. That complexity of those constraints may prevent their attendance, so being sensitive to that. And then consider ways that cultural engagement can be made easier for those with greater constraints. How can you get yourself in front of people who maybe are so strapped that they can't even think about going to a museum, can't even think about going to a concert? How do you get in front of them where they are? And thinking through that a little bit more. So we're going to repeat them again, the two takeaways. Virtually all Connecticut residents do engage with arts, culture, and humanities. And most Connecticut residents think that arts, culture, and humanities deliver important impacts in Connecticut and support the state's investment in the sector. Not even most, but the vast majority do so. Okay. So that wraps up the presentation part. We still have a few minutes, and I can stay a few minutes extra if we need to. But I know I want to be respectful of people's time at the 10 o'clock, 1 o'clock cutoff. So any thoughts or questions that we should share here?
So please feel free to put your questions in the chat, or if you want to come off mute, raise your hand and we'll try to do a queue for people that have questions and answer them that way here. And again, I can stay a little bit after 1 as well, but we'll probably do a formal end in a few moments and recording because I know a lot of people are on their lunch breaks and joining us today. But please put your questions in the chat or raise your hand and come off mute.
You answered everything. Oh, there's some. Oh. Any conclusions about philanthropy? Many of us depend on donations. Yeah, I mean, I'm not just speaking about the Connecticut data here when I talk about philanthropy. I'm thinking bigger picture. But there are some things that we do tend to see in broader population sampling, as well as we do a lot of really deep work with museum goers in particular nationally. And life stage has a lot to do with philanthropy, which is not a big surprise. We tend to think about, the larger donors tending to be older. So if you think about young adults without children, and you think about all the financial constraints in their lives, we hear a lot about that in the media, but it's pretty true that there's a lot of struggles for young adults, and especially if you think about on top of those struggles for those jobs and making ends meet is the costs of just adulting and setting up your first apartment, trying to buy a house, all those things. We don't tend to see huge numbers of philanthropy coming out of young adults because they just they're stretched financially for the most part. Now, there are exceptions and smaller gifts are certainly possible, but that we don't even see them thinking about it as much. For parents and guardians of young children in particular, 10 and younger, when it comes to culture, they tend to look at memberships from a very transactional standpoint. They will stand there at the Children's Museum and do the math. How many times would I have to visit for the membership to be worthwhile? 3 times. Okay, will we visit 3 times? Yes, no. If yes, they'll do the membership. If no, they don't. It's going to be renewed based on whether it makes financial sense for them. So for a lot of parents and guardians, they're making that assessment, whatever that cultural organization is going to be. It's very transactional. And that's why there's so much churn among those kinds of museums in particular, but also probably children's theaters and things like that. But what we do tend to see is once kids are kind of out of the house, or once you get into that 50 plus range, that's when we do tend to see that people are more likely to be joining as a member because they support the mission. And so thinking through all of that is, when you're talking to younger donors, it might be talking through, we're making it easier for you to visit more frequently, but now we need to make it easier for other people to visit more frequently too. You're going to be thinking through that transactional lens, even if you're thinking about trying to increase that gift, versus for older adults, it's going to be primarily, you really care about history, you really care about ballet, whatever it is, and that more mission piece. But what we'd also see is something similar that, it's a small percentage of older adults who are making those gifts similar to their visitation. Okay,
Kathy's got a question she wants to ask live. So let's go to that.
Okay.
And there's a couple other questions in the chat.
Sure.
Hi, thank you so much, Scott. So Susie, thank you for this. This was wonderful information and really appreciate it. And it's usable. I'm just wondering, will there ultimately be sort of an executive summary with some of these points that we could use for our own messaging?
There is an executive summary, and I will put it in the chat again as well with just the top level things for you to share with your board or others. So I just put it in the chat now.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
There was a question from the folks at the Mattatuck Museum
How far
about
people
if you
are
asked
willing
anything
to
about the
travel.
distance people were willing to travel for the kinds of experiences you were surveying about.
Yeah, we did not ask that. The only piece of data that we have right now, which is related but a little tangential, and I'm actually gonna pull it up on my screen because I can get it really quickly because I had it open right before. Let me just find it, and then I'm going to share my screen because I don't want to make everybody get car sick. Basically, I'm scrolling.
Well, while you're looking for that, just to a point that someone made that, this has interesting implications for folk with our aging population. I think, again, we have to know where trends are and we have to understand what demographics are wanting. So very much so. And it's all pieces of the puzzle we want to give you to be able to help you make good decisions.
Okay, so this is sort of related, but not really, but still interesting. What we asked, this is national sampling across the United States. This was in the field a couple weeks ago. This is a sample of 2,000 US adults. And this is goes concurrent to the annual survey of museum goers. We have a very museum specific question in a second, but the first question we asked is, in the past few years, have any of the following negatively affected your leisure time activities or travel plans? Inflation. So about half of respondents said that. COVID or public health concerns. Extreme weather, about a third. Concerns about violence and crime, about a quarter. And then about 20% said none of these. Okay. We want to focus on the inflation. And so then what we asked, if you're cutting back on expenses due to inflation, how does that affect your museum going? And this is where we're going to get to some tangential data. So we have some people who are saying they stop visiting museums entirely. These are at this point, this is people who are willing to go to a museum. So the people who don't ever really go to museums were not in this question. Visiting museums less often, about half. But here is where we have that tangential thing. More likely to visit local museums or day trip instead of taking an overnight trip. And that's where I think we have a little bit of insight, but even though it's not totally answering your question, is that there may be an opportunity to position yourself as that more affordable day trip, where they're not traveling perhaps as far, but more that regional base to mitigate the inflationary concerns that some people are having. And then you can see using memberships to save money, looking for coupons or discount passes, visiting them for your reduced admission days. And then some people are like, we're concerned about inflation, but I'm not cutting back on museums or other cultural attractions. So this, we're going to really just look at this. This is the part that gives you a little information about that, even though that's not exactly your question.
I am going to say it's 1:03 right now. I know Susie said she could stay for a little bit later, and I'm able to stay for a little bit as well. But want to give this as an opportunity to first of all, thank Susie for all the great work she's doing on behalf of all of us here in Connecticut. Thank Amris and Emily and everyone at CLHO again for giving us the forum and being such great hosts of these info sessions. But we can stop recording. If folks need to go, please do go. But we can stay around and answer some more questions. And again, we'll share all the links out as well in an email afterwards with this recording. But again, this is just the continuing work we're doing at Connecticut Humanities to be advocating on your behalf to keep the cultural fund continuing and to give you data at your institutions to be more connected to your communities and to be good advocates on behalf of all the important work that you do. So again, thanks to all of you for spending the time with us today. We'll look forward to giving you more information as we've got it in the coming weeks and months.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Susie. Thanks, Emily. Thanks, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, everyone.